For day one presentations, we will cover a variety of topics, which include clinical trials safety data, clinical trial innovation, diversity in clinical trials, clinicaltrials.gov. Are you sensing a theme here? Artificial intelligence and combination products. Then we'll finish up the day by offering a one-to-one open session where you can ask your questions in a little less public environment. But whenever you ask questions, whether you come up to the mics or whether you ask questions in a one-to-one, please keep in mind that we are unable to address specific application questions. And each speaker will entertain questions during their presentation. At that time, we'll have the mics, one to the left, one to the right. Please step up to the mics in-house, and then we'll alternate with the online questions. As you saw in the plenary, we'll take one question from each person and go around until we exhaust the questions all the time, whichever comes first. So now, without much further ado, let's go to our first session for the day, which will address selective safety data collection in clinical trials. This presentation discusses the recent ICH E19 guideline and its adoption by several regulatory authorities, including FDA, in an effort to facilitate the conduct of important clinical trials designed to answer questions about the long-term efficacy and safety of drugs. Our speaker today will be Dr. Mary Thanh Hai, who is the Deputy Director for Clinical within the Office of New Drugs at CDER. Please let us welcome Dr. Mary Thanh Hai.
Thank you, Brenda, and thank you for the organizers of this meeting for inviting me. So I'm Mary Thanh Hai, Deputy Director for Clinical, and I'm really excited to talk to you about this topic, selective safety data collection in clinical trials. I was also the rapporteur for the expert work group that worked together with many regulatory agencies and industry representatives as part of the International Council for Harmonization to develop the ICH E19 guideline. So what I'm hoping that you will actually get out of my presentation today are the following things. First, to understand what is selective safety data collection. To understand the importance of ICH E19 guideline to selective safety data collection, and particularly in global drug development. And finally, to describe situations where and how selective safety data collection can be implemented in drug development. I'm hoping that there actually be other learnings in here as well, but I'm only going to cover these three here as the learning objectives in the final questions and answer, polling question, excuse me. So the outline of my presentation will first cover defining what is selective safety data collection. I'm going to give you some background for the development of E19. I'm going to talk about the scope of E19, and when I talk about the scope of E19, it's specific to the guideline or the guidance, the FDA guidance. An important part is actually what is the purpose of safety monitoring clinical trials. This is going to be that balance between safety monitoring and what E19 or selective safety data collection entails. And then I'm also going to talk about what we mean when we talk about reduction in data collection, or what data really should generally always be collected. And then I'll also talk about possible trial scenarios and methodologies for implementing E19. Oops, why is this going so quickly? And then I'll conclude remarks in the next steps. So first, what is selective safety data collection? I'm just going to say SSDC. SSDC refers to the prospectively planned reduction and collection of certain types of data in a clinical trial for drugs with a well-characterized safety profile where continued collection of comprehensive data may provide only limited additional knowledge of clinical importance. So a couple of things I want to emphasize here in this definition. Prospectively planned reduction. That's really important. You have to think about this, whether or not it's appropriate in your clinical trial. The other thing that's important is a well-characterized safety profile. So this is not a one-size-fits-all. This is not every drug, every clinical trial can actually implement SSDC. And really, the last part is that once you get to that stage, you've already planned it, you actually know that this is a well-characterized safety profile for a drug. What is the gain that you have in this? Because if you fit those criteria, continued collection of all safety data that is comprehensive may actually not add so much more to the knowledge in terms of doing an assessment with respect to benefit and risk of that therapy in the indication in the clinical trial that you're investigating. So SSDC or E19 is really an innovative approach to clinical drug development, conduct of clinical trials. It's innovative, but it's not something that hasn't been done before. And so it's something that I really want to emphasize, that while this is innovative, it is not so novel that we need to be concerned so that we don't have experience with it. And I will talk about how we do have experience, and I'm not sure why it's moving forward. And the reason why I say that, some of you may have actually heard about SSDC, particularly at FDA, because we actually had issued a final guidance in 2016 entitled Determining the Extent of Safety Data Collection Needed in Late-Stage Pre-Market and Post-Approval Clinical Investigations. And I remember when this guidance came out, I was at that time the Division Director for Metabolic and Endocrine, and we had a lot of clinical trials that are being conducted to evaluate cardiovascular safety, both in the pre-approval and post-approval. Most of it was in the post-approval stage. And speaking with industry representatives and saying, have you heard about this guidance? Because you're focusing just on cardiovascular safety. You can implement some degree of focused, targeted safety data collection. And some of the things I heard back was, yes, Mary, we're aware about that guidance. However, not everybody in FDA actually is aware of that guidance. But the other thing here is that it's an FDA guidance. Our drug development program is global. And so, we can do that here for you, but we can't necessarily do that in Japan or in Europe. So that leads to the question, why was E19 proposed for development as the ICH guideline? It was proposed because, for the reason I just referred to, is that drug development is a global endeavor. And there really was an important need to have alignment between regulators and industry. It was essential to advance those principles that were laid out in a previously published FDA guidance on this topic. And just to talk a little bit about the ICH process, it started in 2017, and it involved not just the founding members, regulatory members, so that would be the US, EMA, and also Japan, but there are others since then, regulatory agencies that are part of it, and also their industry representatives. The expert work group was comprised of about 30 people working together over a period of about 5 years, meeting on an annual basis. Initially it was in Montreal, and then to Geneva, Switzerland, and then we came back to North Carolina, and we were actually also in Japan and Singapore. So it wasn't a painful process. It was actually a wonderful opportunity to work with many of our colleagues to actually get this across the finish line. This is moving too quickly, to actually get a harmonized guideline. And what the objectives of E19 was, first, to provide recommendations regarding appropriate use of a selective approach to safety data collection in some late stage or post-marketing studies of drugs where the safety profile with respect to commonly occurring adverse events is well understood and documented. And the thought here is that by tailoring that method of safety data collection, it may enable greater efficiency in the conduct of clinical trials, and that this may facilitate the conduct of large efficacy and safety clinical trials with a large number of participants and long-term follow-up. And as I mentioned, it was a 5-year process. We crossed the finish line. We got to step 4 of the ICH process in September of 2022, when we actually published the finalized ICH E19. And shortly after that, we're now in step 5. Shortly after that, FDA issued its final guidance in December, and this is signaling that FDA is now implementing ICH E19. Other regulatory agencies have done so as well. And the scope of E19 are the following. First, it's to interventional clinical trials. Most often it's in the post-approval trials. But in some circumstances, it can also be considered for pre-approval trials. It's not applicable to gene therapy or rare orphan disease clinical trials. And what I'm saying here is that the scope of the guideline, what we focus on when we wrote that guideline, we did not actually target gene therapy or rare orphan disease clinical trials. Certainly, I can entertain questions if that comes up about applying it here. And then finally, SSDC needs to follow the principles. If you follow the principles of SSDC in the guidance, it must also need to understand it does not alter your local regional safety reporting requirements. So what is the purpose of actually safety monitoring? It has two purposes. First is to protect the safety and well-being of individual trial participants. And the second is to obtain safety information to be used in the assessment of the risk profile of the investigational medicinal product. Now, at this point, you may ask, well, there seems to be a conflict when you define SSDC, and now you're saying that the whole purpose of monitoring safety in a clinical trial is to protect safety of the patients and obtain safety information. But if this is actually a prospectively planned reduction in collection of safety data, how do you achieve that? And you achieve that because, remember, you need to understand that your drug has a well-characterized safety profile. It does not mean that the investigator or the healthcare provider's responsibility to the patient is in any way at all removed. They still have that responsibility to ensure the safety of the patient. So that's the monitoring aspect of it. But the collection and the reporting of safety information that would not add any further to the understanding of the benefit risk of the drug does not need to be collected onto the CRFs and reported to regulatory agencies. So that's where there isn't a disconnect. It's just to make it very clear that this does not in any way at all take away the obligation to the investigator to ensure safety in the patient population. So when is the safety profile of a drug well understood and documented? The guidance does list several factors for consideration, but it's not considered to be an exhaustive list or determinative. So as a starting point, what is the regulatory status of the drug? So as an example, has the drug already been approved? That makes sense because if it's already been approved, it has actually already gone through a regulatory review process and an understanding of the safety profile. Now, what is the mechanistic factors of the drug? Do we know the mechanism of action, including any untoward effects? Is it one of many in a class, or is it first in class? If it's one in many, and you may actually know a lot about the class of drug itself. What about the clinical safety database of the drug? What are the number and duration of exposure, the dose, intensity of the safety monitoring of that clinical safety database? And what's the similarity of the planned clinical trial where you intend to implement SSDC to previous trials? So how similar is it with respect to the patient population, the dosing regimen? The further away you get from the further away, note to self, animation sometimes can be problematic. The further you get away from the knowledge or the evidence that leads you to make the conclusion of a well-characterized safety profile, the harder it is to implement SSDC. The other thing that to consider is the clinical pharmacology. What do you know about how that drug is metabolized, how it's absorbed? Drug-drug interactions is important as well. The non-clinical data from the safety and pharmacologic effects, are they well characterized from animal studies or non-clinical studies? And if it's already an approved drug, what do we have with respect to post-authorization data, the extent and the quality of the post-marketing safety data? So when it has been determined and agreed to with regulatory authorities that SSDC may be appropriate for clinical trial, collection of certain information may be limited or reduced in frequency of collection. And this needs to be specified in the protocol. Another point to emphasize here is that really selective safety data collection is something that you propose in a protocol and you get agreement with the regulatory agencies. So things that you might be able to reduce or eliminate or reduce in frequency of collection, some of the non-serious adverse events, some laboratory monitoring, physical exams and vital sign data, or concomitant medications. And I have an asterisk here to point out that if a serious adverse event actually does occur or an adverse event of special interest, some of these some of this information that's actually that you can reduce, you would probably want to collect it in the surrounding of a particular serious adverse events to better characterize or understand that event, to investigate that event. The other thing to understand is that even if you're going to reduce some of those events and collection during the trial, they really need to be collected at baseline. So at baseline, comprehensive safety data collection is important because you need to understand the patient's profile. Should something happen, there can be a better understanding in terms of change from baseline. Also, importantly, generally, one should expect that the following will be collected: serious adverse events, important medical events, medication errors or overdose, intentional or unintentional, adverse events that lead to a study drug discontinuation, pregnancy and lactation exposure and their outcome, and adverse events of special interest, including lab abnormalities. And this, again, is identified in the protocol. So what are the situations where selective safety data collection can be considered? An approved drug that is seeking a new indication in a similar population to the one that is already approved. An example here could be a drug that's actually been approved for reduction in risk in atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, and now the company comes in and they want to expand the indication for reduction in risk of peripheral vascular disease. Another situation could be it's an approved drug that's seeking to expand the label to include additional endpoints in the same patient population. So, example, let's say a drug that's actually approved for the reduction in hospitalization due to heart failure, and now they actually want to come in that same population to get some claim with respect to a patient-reported outcome, some quality of life claim in the label. Another one is a safety trial with an objective to investigate specific safety concern. This is particularly in the setting of, on the FDA side, FDAA requirements and PMRs. I mentioned that when we had the 2016 guidance, there were a lot of cardiovascular safety trials being conducted in the diabetes space. Well, there it was very, very focused on one particular or particular safety events, and that's where it could be targeted. Some of the other non-serious or safety issues may not be as important to collect, and you can reduce collection in those other events. And finally, you can also consider it where you have a trial that's designed to provide additional evidence of efficacy when the current available data support a well-characterized safety profile. Now, this one here needs a little bit of explanation here. Let's say, for example, you actually have a product, an application before the agency, and it had two trials in order to demonstrate substantial evidence of effectiveness. One trial was positive, the other one was not. And there are maybe a variety of reasons why the other one was not. But either way, because of that, it could not be approved because it had not met the statutory requirement of showing substantial evidence of effectiveness. However, in both those trials and the whole program, there was enough information to understand the safety profile of the drug. In this situation, the company would be told you need to do another study to actually demonstrate substantial evidence of effectiveness, but you can reduce some of your safety collection. And that's an important consideration because it just means that important second trial that they have to do, a third trial they have to do, they can focus on actually showing efficacy. They've already convinced us at least of the safety profile. Now, so what are the possible approaches to implementing SSDC in a clinical trial? The first one is just selective safety data collection in everyone, probably the easiest way of implementing it in the protocol and operationalizing it. Another one is to do a comprehensive collection for a specific subset, but you can have SSDC and the rest. A situation here would be if in your safety database, you don't have enough information on a subset of the population. Let's say the elderly patient population. You might want to have a comprehensive safety data collection in the elderly population, but the rest you can do SSDC. You can also have comprehensive collection everyone initially and SSDC thereafter. A scenario here would be an LDL cholesterol lowering drug. It gets approved just on LDL cholesterol lowering, but pre-approval, they've actually initiated their cardiovascular outcomes trial. Since the drug hasn't been approved yet, they are going to implement comprehensive collection, but as they get to approval, they begin to know a lot more about the drug. After approval, they may consider implementing SSDC after approval. And then finally, another approach is comprehensive collection and representative subset and SSCC for remainder patients. So this can be done a random sample of patients or a random selection of regions where you can have SSDC in some and comprehensive in another. Either way, the approach really, again, needs to be spelled out in the protocol. So as I mentioned before, SSDC or E19, well, E19 is novel in the sense that it was just recently finalized and being implemented. SSDC itself is not necessarily something that has not been done before. It actually has. And what I have here on the slide here is a publication by actually two of my colleagues on the expert work group, Yukiko Watabe and Hironori Sakai, the senior authors in this paper. They are from Japan Manufacturing Association, Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Association. And they actually wanted to evaluate the landscape in clinical trials in New England Journal of Medicine to see whether there was any mention in the publication about the study that could have been implementation of SSDC. And this was done in advance of us actually, I think it was step 2, when we actually issued a draft guideline for public comment. Their approach, they did a literature search of trials that were published in the New England Journal of Medicine from a period of February 2016 through December of 2019. This was the time frame before the guideline was actually published in draft form. And they reviewed the text and protocols and the SAPs of these trials to identify if there were any terms that would suggest it was adoption of selective safety data collection. And how they defined it was that these were trials that would not necessarily collect some of the adverse events that were commonly collected in clinical trials. And what they found was that out of 459 papers that reports the results of clinical trials, 9.6% of them actually had some terminology identified as adopting selective safety data collection. What's also interesting about the 44 trials in this time frame was that in terms of the therapeutic area, more than half of them were in the cardiovascular space. And most of them were cardiovascular outcomes trials. So they were very focused on identifying either a benefit or evaluating a safety concern. It was followed by infectious disease and then oncology. And then the other interesting thing is that over 90% of these trials were actually conducted before 2017. So well in advance of ICH E19 actually being published. So some key considerations before implementing selective safety data collection. First, is the safety profile of the drug well characterized? Do the study objectives and design of the trial support selective safety data collection? And then finally, has agreement been reached with regulatory agency on the protocol implementing selective safety data collection? So where are we right now, the next step? E19 is at step 5 of the ICH process, which means that since the guideline is finalized, it's all the different regulatory agencies and will now have to implement it according to their own protocol within their specific region or country. And I list here the members and regions where ICH E19 has been implemented. I haven't looked at the site, but you can go to the site to actually see if anything has been updated. But this is really exciting because, as I mentioned, in 2016, there was just the FDA guidance. And in spite of just being FDA, there were already some trials, which if I'm willing to bet that if you look at those trials, they were global trials as well, where it's been implemented. But to have this actually signed on by many different regulatory agencies, this is really an opportunity for us to continue to promote this more broadly. I know that when we actually reach step 4, and essentially when you get to that point, the expert work group is disbanded. It was really a wonderful work group to develop this guideline on. But as a group, we really felt that this was something that was important as a guideline or guidance that shouldn't actually just collect dust on the shelf, that we need to really get this out and encourage companies and sponsors to actually consider this in their clinical drug development program. Hence the conversation today I'm having with all of you. And on that note, I do want to actually talk a little bit about the efforts that the FDA has to further promote selective safety data collection. As you may have heard, we announced in April the establishment of C3TI, the Center for Trial Innovation, which you'll hear a little bit more from my colleague in the next presentation. But E19, or selective safety data collection, was identified as a demonstration project. So if you on this particular slide here has some information, you can learn more about the guidance itself through a podcast. There's a summary of the guidance snapshot. But importantly is that any company that thinks that there's an opportunity for a clinical trial there's to implement SSDC, we would really encourage you to reach out to the agency to have a discussion on whether or not it would be appropriate to be part of a demonstration project and engagement more closely with the agency, and also to help facilitate any interactions with other regulatory agencies that would also need to sign on to an E19 approach for the trial. So in conclusion, ICH E19 guideline will have a significant impact on the feasibility and efficiency of clinical trials designed to yield important new medical knowledge and advance public health. So now let's see how I did in the learning objectives. So your first challenge question, selective safety data collection refers to A, eliminating safety data collection entirely in a trial with a drug that has a well-established safety profile. B, prospectively planned reduction in collection of certain types of data in a clinical trial for drugs with a well-characterized safety profile. And finally, C, only collecting safety information in patients who experience an adverse event. And, not AN, not A and D. So I don't know if, is there a voting mechanism now? Will people raise their hands? Just raise hands? Okay, so let me just go through again. So who says selective safety data collection refers to A, eliminating safety data collection entirely in a trial with a drug that has a well-established safety profile? Excellent. B, prospectively planned reduction and collection of certain types of data in a clinical trial for drugs with a well-characterized safety profile. Excellent, very good. That was the right answer. And obviously the last one, only collecting safety information patients. No. All right, second question. I hope this one's a little bit more challenging. Which scenario would not be appropriate for SSDC? A, an already approved drug for reduction of cardiovascular disease risk in type 2 diabetes is now being studied for reduction in peripheral vascular disease and type 2 diabetes. B, a phase 2 dose response study of a first-in-class immunomodulator being developed for the treatment of pediatric dermatoses. And C, a post-approval safety trial evaluating the risk of renal failure where the only safety signal of concern pre-approval was imbalances in serum creatinine elevation. So again, the question is, which scenario would not be appropriate for SSDC? It's always those negative questions. So is A not appropriate for SSDC? Anybody raise their hand? B, is a phase 2 dose response study of a first-in-class immunomodulator being developed for the treatment of pediatric dermatosis. Is that not appropriate for SSDC? Okay, got some hands up. And then C, a post-approval safety trial evaluating the risk of renal failure where the only safety signal of concern pre-approval were imbalances in serum creatinine elevation. Is that one not appropriate for SSDC? Okay, there were some folks who didn't want to commit, but the show of hands, the only show of hands was for B, which is the correct answer. It's a phase 2 dose response study of a first-in-class immunomodulator. So you probably don't know a whole lot about of the safety profile of the drug at the phase 2 stage, also first-in-class. I threw in there the pediatric dermatosis, the pediatric population. The guideline doesn't actually exclude pediatric studies, but I think that there's probably always going to be a little bit more caution in a more vulnerable patient population. So with that, I am happy to entertain any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Thanh Hai. All right, so we know, I'm sorry?
Do you want me to sit down?
You can have a seat if you want to be more comfortable. Can she have a seat? She's not mic'd up. I've forgotten, yeah. I'm just delirious with happiness. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. Questions in the room?
Yeah,
Please, we have two mics, so please, if you want to come up to another mic, please.
yeah, thank you for that. I'm happy to see ICH 19 moving forward that way. I know there's been trials back in 2012. I worked on trying to get FDA convince them to reduce collection. My question is really a logistical question: is how do you manage a protocol, like a free-form response of how you feel? Because they're always going to answer maybe something that was not part of what you're restricting in terms of data collection. So that's my first thing. The second thing is, when I thought of reducing data collection, it was more like data reporting. So we would have the data, but we wouldn't actually report it to the agencies. It would always be in the case report forms or somewhere. So I'm just curious about the differences there and how you actually implement that on the case report form too. You just, if there's a free form part of that to answer about how do you feel?
Thank you for that question. So actually, specifically in the guideline, and I didn't put it in the slide, but when we talk about SSDC and E19, it's about the collection of the information on the case report form, and then to actually report it to the regulatory agencies. And it was very specific in that setting there, because we know that if sponsors are telling their investigators that you need to actually collect and capture this in the case report forms, that is actually additional work that you do. You have to actually solicit that information. The question you really have to ask is that, why do you need to solicit that information? That's very different from monitoring. And whether or not, if you're going to collect it, then you're going to have to feel the obligation of actually reporting it to the regulatory agencies. So that was the distinction I was making with respect to safety, selective safety data collection. If you don't think that this is something, whatever the safety, I shouldn't say the adverse event, whatever the safety information is, whether it be EKGs or physical exams, that's not necessarily a safety information, but it's a test or a procedure that you're doing. If you don't think that that's actually necessary to continue to ensure the safety of the patient, then that's not something that needs to be put in the protocol to collect in the CRF. And if you don't have it on the CRF, you won't be reporting it to the agency. So I hope that actually answers your question. And I forgot your first question.
No, it just had to do with, if you ask the free-form question, the investigator says, how do you feel? Then some of these issues may come up. Do they not get put on the case report form then if the investigator is asking a question, how do you feel, which is pretty typical in a clinical trial?
So I'm not sure if I understand. So you're asking the investigator how do they feel, or you're talking about the patient?
The patient. So
Oh.
the investigator asks how you feel, and the patient writes down some of these things that are not part of data collection. They go into some other. Are they not then reported, or are they just, they're in the case report form at that point. We've limited reporting on some of the adverse events I've worked on. I'm just curious, how you manage that.
Well, so I think how I'm going to answer this without trying to actually get into advising on a particular drug development program, because I don't know the details of it. I'm going to assume that as an investigator, when your patient or the participant comes in, I would assume that's just a good patient physician practice, is to ask, how are you doing? How have you been since the last visit? And they may, talk about a lot of things. Again, it's protocol defined. Remember, it's prospectively planned decision in terms of what's going to be collected and what's going to be reported. If the patient actually said, well, since the last time I was in, I had such and such, and as the investigator, you are the investigator, by the way, it is a requirement that they have to be trained and have the expertise to be able to carry out the objectives or the protocol and objectives of the trial. If they determine based on their scientific knowledge that this is not an essential part of ensuring the safety of the patient and it's not in the protocol, then that wouldn't be something that's going to be reported to the agency. Does that help?
Yeah.
Next question to my left, please.
She's first. You want first?
We're alternating.
Okay. So I have a question about how do you define the safety collection for the trial with infant, children, and adults?
Okay, so selective safety data collection, infants.
For infant trial, children trial, and then adult trial.
Okay, well, the criteria, or as I mentioned, the things that you have to absolutely be sure is you feel that the trial or the drug has a well-established safety profile. And then after that, then the question is, can that be applied to the trial and the patient population? So if you actually have a drug that has a well-established safety profile, but it's never been studied in the pediatric population, it's probably something that you would not be comfortable. And the other thing here is that you obviously need to have buy-in from the regulatory agencies as well. You would need to make that justification that the population that's going to be studied, and where in a trial where you want to implement SSDC, you have enough data from prior studies, prior evidence, and I gave you a whole long list that is not determinative but can be helpful. If none of those actually can be applied to the new patient population, it's probably not something that you want to implement in a pediatric or a neonatal population. Does that help?
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, that we experience with COVID vaccine also. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's go online for a question, please, and then we'll come back.
How would a sponsor reach agreement with FDA on the protocol implementing SSDC? What is the best way, and how long would it take for FDA to reach a decision regarding if SSDC is acceptable?
Okay, so that's a very good question. So this would be implemented as part of a protocol, and most likely it will be, let's say, a pivotal trial. I suppose one could actually make an argument it doesn't have to be a pivotal trial, but more likely it'll be a pivotal trial. Protocols would be submitted to the agency. You could flag it with specific questions, as a submission to the agency. And I can't remember the exact time frame, but usually the time frame in terms of responding to these types of questions is probably in a period of 45 days to 2 months. Because there's an understanding if it's a pivotal trial, we don't want to wait too long, because companies actually need to be able to get this understanding to move forward with that. Certainly if this is something that you want to implement in a phase 3 program, you can certainly bring it up in a phase 2 meeting as well, where you may not have the protocol all spelled out, but you want to flag for the agency when we're planning on implementing selective safety data collection, and we will also be sending in the protocol. So those are different ways that you can approach the FDA about this being put into the protocol and getting feedback on it.
Thank you. Let's go. If you
Yes.
want to step up a little bit close to the mic.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So this is actually very similar to the question that was raised online. Considering that this guidance has been around since 2016, have you already received protocols with this SSDC? Second part is, now that it is part of demonstration project, how is it different? Could we just submit the protocol with the reduced safety data collection for a post-approval study under our IND? Or what is the pros and cons of doing it via the demonstration project versus to the IND? Thank you.
So very good questions. The first one, are we receiving it? We have not established a database or a process to systematically identify these as they come in. That's something we're working on. I think that's really important. It's nice to track to see that I'm hoping to see an increase on it. And I'm hoping that the efforts like from today or other meetings, by the way, I don't know if anyone's going to DIA in June, but there will be a session on E19 as well, that getting that message out there, we will see an increase on that. So the second question is, what is the benefit of being in a demonstration project versus actually submitting it to an IND and getting agreement? And I'm going to actually, I don't know if Dr. Bugin will respond to that in his talk. I think the benefit is that you'd have greater interaction engagement with SMEs within the agency at many different levels to give you feedback on that protocol And particularly if this is one a very challenging one, you may have to engage also with other regulatory agencies. It would have to be accepted in the program. The other aspect there is that there has to be an understanding that if you're accepted into the demonstration project, there is a willingness on the sponsor's part to actually publicly share those learnings with the public. And that's really important. If you think about MIDD and CID and also the drug development tool qualification program, you heard that from Rob Caleb this morning. He's talking about all the different approaches that the agency has for innovation. It doesn't help if you have innovation, but you only keep it close to your chest and you don't share it. So it's really important to agree to share that with others so they can say, this actually does work, or it didn't work. What can we learn from? Why did it not work? So it's not always the success stories that we want to share. Sometimes we have to share things that didn't go well so we can make improvements on it. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Thank you. Let's go with the second question in-house because you've been standing there for a little while.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation and informative discussion on the selective safety data. I wanted to take things a little bit to a different level. We are seeing and experiencing a lot of activities in clinical trials that are happening remotely with the modernization of clinical trials, and with that, the use of technologies to enable these trials. So in terms of, in that context, are there provisions from the agency perspective to deal with the selective safety data collection centrally versus remotely, and in the context of E19 and others?
Okay, so how do we apply, if I can paraphrase, how would we be able to apply selective safety data collection in different novel ways of conducting trials, such as remote monitoring or decentralized trials or digital health technology? Does that sound?
Yes, or even real world evidence. I mean, yes.
Okay. Well, I think first and foremost, from selective safety data collection, you need to, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but you need to be sure that you have confidence in the safety profile of the drug and you know what you need to collect and what you don't need to collect. So once you have that, then the question is the things that you are going to collect because you think that it's important, that's where you're going to implement more novel approaches collecting, whether it be remote monitoring or digital health technologies. That's perhaps a different area that you have to address because you still need quality data in that setting there. So if you're going to, let's say, still collect a particular adverse event, but your intent here is to collect it through some DHT, some tool that's novel, there still has to be an understanding that that tool can actually adequately collect that information, that it's reliable. So that speaks to the quality of the data. So SSDC does not absolve you of that obligation at all, and sponsors will still need to make sure that that new technology can actually deliver on that. I think where the two will really go hand in hand is that when you start to reduce collection of unnecessary information, you actually make it more feasible to do things such as decentralized trial, remote monitoring, because it may mean that patients don't have to come in every month. They can come in on a 6-month basis. And if some of those events that are still considered necessary to ensure adequate assessment of benefit and risk, if those fewer events that are being collected can actually then be done in a remote setting, it does facilitate, it does go hand in hand. Does that?
It's okay. We can discuss later. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
Thank you very much. This was our last question. If you have more questions for Dr. Thanh Hai, please get her in. You'll be around a little bit.
Yes, until lunch.
Okay, thank you. Okay, our next speaker, I got so many mics. Which one? Our next topic is all about enhancing clinical trial innovation. And this presentation will address new efforts and share opportunities for stakeholders to engage with CDER on clinical trial innovation. Our speaker will be Dr. Kevin Bugin, who is the Deputy Director for the Office of New Drugs within CDER. Welcome, Dr. Bugin.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks again to Brenda and the REdI folks for putting this on, and great job at getting us back in person.
Good to see you.
As I think I raised my hand earlier, I think I did my first REdI
Good, good.
conference
You attended.
probably 10 years ago, maybe 11 years ago. So it's just really great to be here. And then most excited that O&D is kind of taken over this morning and maybe even filtering out into the rest of the day, because there's a lot of discussion about clinical trials. And I think clinical trials and clinical research is just so critically important to what we do at the FDA to help promote health and help improve the quality of life for patients. So what I'm going to talk about today is the new CDER Center for Clinical Trial Innovation. So I think you heard about this multiple times already today, and that's excellent. But I'm going to just reinforce it so that you leave today really remembering C3TI and what C3TI is, and it's not a robot from Star Wars. But hey, if you remember that, you'll remember C3TI. So C3TI, or the CDER Center for Clinical Trial Innovation, was launched on April 15th, and it was intended to enable and amplify innovative approaches to the conduct and design of clinical trials, ultimately to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of drug development. Now, there have been a lot of programs going on for many years within CDER and across the FDA, enable or intended to enable or promote clinical trial innovation. You heard about several of them also already this morning, such as the Complex Innovative Designs Program, which is focusing on new statistical methods or approaches to designing clinical trials, such as master protocols or building in interim analyses, et cetera. You also heard about, had a great question here too, about the use of digital health technologies. So these are things like wearables that can enable patients to more directly contribute to the data that's being generated and collected in a clinical trial. We also have programs to qualify drug development tools, which are intended to sort of give both the FDA and sponsors that reassurance of the reliability, verification, and validity of those tools that are being used in clinical development programs and model-informed drug development. And I could go on, many programs here. And really what C3TI is trying to do is help facilitate those existing programs, help them amplify the great message. I kind of say, like, I'm the cheerleader of all those existing programs to help get that message out to groups like this. You all are learning about clinical trials today and learning about the most innovative approaches, not the approaches that have been around for many, many decades, although those are tried and true and still excellent, but really helping to ensure that as we design the trials of tomorrow, that we are always using the most fit for purpose and appropriate tools and approaches. All right. Now, so yes, did I go the right way? I did. Okay. So how did we get here? This really kind of stems from a personal passion of mine. So in 2020, like many of us, we probably experienced something different during the pandemic, and maybe we stepped up and played different roles trying to help out because we all wanted to contribute to helping folks get through the pandemic. And I played a role in the US government's response on the therapeutics development side of things, what was called Operation Warp Speed at that time. I was not working on the vaccines, I was working on the therapeutics. So this is the drug track over here in CDER. And what we were doing was launching a lot of different trials. Most of them are master protocol trials in collaboration with the NIH through the ACTIV Consortium, which was the Advancing Clinical Trials, Clinical Therapeutics, and Vaccines. And through that process, we experienced all the challenges that every sponsor and CRO was experiencing during the pandemic, which was, it was very hard to get sites ready. It was very hard to launch these new trials. All the trials and sites were trying to make their clinical programs more decentralized because patients were in lockdown. They weren't able to come in for visits as often as they needed to, particularly if you were in the outpatient setting. And so it was very challenging. And yet we had all these tools. We had these ideas around making trials decentralized. We had digital health technologies. We had more advanced, complex, innovative designs. But it wasn't quite getting the level of adoption that we had expected. Now, the great news is fast forward a couple of years, we had learned we could do some of these things. And we were seeing this tremendous amount of guidance, lots of new programs being released from the FDA. But then suddenly come around 2023, again, a year ago, and we look back and we started to see some backsliding. And we started to ask ourselves, why is this? So we opened up a public docket last October to try and understand from external stakeholders sort of what are those barriers or facilitators, if there are things that work well, we want to know what those are too, that help promote the adoption of innovative approaches to clinical trials. We pulled all that information together, and just a few months ago in March, we had a public meeting to discuss what those were. And what we heard were many different things relating to, oh, we have great examples of this where it's happened. We have phenomenal guidance, but a lot of times we just don't understand how to do this at an operational level. Every trial is a little unique. Every patient population, every drug, every disease, it's always a little bit unique. And so the guidances, while are absolutely necessary, aren't always sufficient. Like, we need to have these conversations around how we implement these new approaches each time we do it so that we can all learn. And this is really where C3TI comes in. So the idea, again, to promote and enable and amplify all the great information related to clinical trial innovation, we want to do this in 3 key ways. We want to share lessons learned. So every time we hear about a great trial that's maybe implemented these selective safety data collection approaches, as Dr. Thanh Hai mentioned this morning, maybe some of the other programs that I'll talk about in a few minutes, we want to share that broadly, kind of put it together in different ways, thinking about it from an implementation science or dissemination perspective, because one trial in the context of oncology may not be super relevant to someone doing a trial in dermatology. However, there's absolutely lessons learned that can be shared if they're adapted and contextualized in different ways. So we want to sort of play a role in that space. Secondly, we want to just communicate and collaborate. Going out, I think I've been at a meeting every week now since we launched in April, and I'm happy to do it, especially when they're local and arranged by Brenda. But the idea that you can engage with the FDA, and we are open to engage with you, and we want to talk to you about these programs and these trials, especially if you have questions around implementing something novel, is really important. That level of openness and interaction and collaboration, I think, is critical as you move into these novel spaces. It helps to kind of de-risk those areas for something that's not new, or for something that is new. And lastly, we want to expand opportunities for innovation. We recognize we have a lot of programs, as I showed on the slide a few minutes ago, but we also have these new areas such as selective safety data collection. We also have new approaches to making trials more pragmatic or integrated at the point of care. And we need to be able to very nimbly launch sort of new efforts to promote those without having to stand up large new separate entities or separate programs. And this is where C3TI comes in. We sort of have a central operations or infrastructure that allows us to very quickly identify the new area and put together a program where we can interact with sponsors on these new trials trying to apply these new approaches. Also, in addition, underneath what C3TI is doing, we have these 4 key activity areas. I've already mentioned the internal and external communications and engagement. So we have an excellent communication shop that puts together these wonderful slides with fancy things like QR codes that I think are really great when you're out at meetings such as this. We also have a central mailbox, the CDER Clinical Trial Innovation at fda.hhs.gov mailbox, where you can send in any question regarding anything that's innovative related to clinical trials. Doesn't mean C3TI is going to answer all these questions, because I don't know everything about everything that is innovative clinical trials, but I know all the people within CDER. Like, I'm very good at making friends and relationships within CDER, and I will sort of be your friend to the friends, and I will help you connect to them. And all of the different programs that we have across CDER, I sort of reroute, make sure if there's not a program for a particular question to go to, who is the most relevant SME or subject matter expert, and try to connect you with that subject matter expert. So we'll be your telephone operator, your kind of electronic yellow book pages, behind the scenes within CDER. Thirdly, we are launching, or we did launch last Monday actually, a centralized knowledge repository that is available to you as well on the external our website for C3TI, which if you click that link, you can kind of get into, and I'm going to also talk about in a minute. This is a phenomenal, very search-friendly, centralized one-stop shop for all of the different records or links out to information on various different clinical trial innovation activities going on, not just within CDER, but also at the FDA. It's not intended to have everything you need. It's not the encyclopedia of all things clinical trial innovation, but it's like those yellow book pages. You can find a link out to another web page or another program or to a case study or to our guidance, et cetera, that can sort of at least get you started on that path. And we're trying to make it very search friendly. We have a nice taxonomy and tagging, and that will improve over time. And then lastly, we have our demonstration program. This is how we will expand those opportunities for innovation by standing up a centralized program that can launch new projects in different spaces of clinical trial innovation whenever we believe we need a little bit more of a push or a nudge to get things going in the space of adoption. Selective safety data collections have been around for, again, probably 10 years. We've seen some pretty good implementation. I think as Dr. Thanh Hai mentioned, they'd seen about 10% implementation prior to the ICH guidance. It's hopefully ticking up since then, but we'd love to see it implemented everywhere it could be implemented. And so this is why C3TI will step in and help provide some additional assistance. So the Compass, this is the direct QR code link here to take you to the C3TI external version of the Compass. We do have an internal version as well. Sorry, you guys can't get access to that one, but that's the one that's got a lot more information. I think it's got about twice as many entries. And the only reason they're not shared with you is because they do contain more confidential or commercial confidential information. So we're trying to pull in links to actual protocol submissions, our reviews of those protocols, ultimately the study reports that come in that have the data from those studies, and then also our reviews, such as the marketing application reviews where we reviewed those studies, because how we internally interpret that information is really important and helpful. We also look for precedents. When we're doing reviews, we don't start from scratch. We go back and see what did we think about this type of an approach in this type of a setting in a prior trial. And so our internal Compass has a little bit more information. But as that information becomes publicly available, and particularly, and I'll talk about this in a minute with the demonstration programs, as sponsors share that, it's no longer then considered commercial confidential. We can start to add it into the external version of the C3TI Compass. But the idea, again, behind the Compass is to sort of help share those lessons learned, create a centralized repository where you can find the links to all that information and go back to it on a regular basis. It can hopefully maybe be your one-stop shop for innovation in clinical trial space. So if you don't remember exactly what was that website for the RWE program, although I think we do a pretty good job with search engine optimization. So if you type in Google FDA RWE, you'll find the RWE program. But in case you didn't know exactly how to search something up, you can find those links through the C3TI Compass. So the demonstration program, as I mentioned, this is a centralized sort of infrastructure to launch projects in targeted areas to explore more scalable improvements in the adoption of these select approaches. I think the SSDC is a phenomenal example because you just had the sort of primer on that and you understand really what that is. But again, where we think this might be perfect in the appropriate settings where we have a well-established safety profile and it makes sense in the particular new setting of a new trial in that population, we're still not seeing the level of adoption that we think would be most appropriate. So we want to sort of launch a new project to do demonstrations to help give that a little bit more of a nudge. So as Dr. Thanh Hai mentioned, when you submit a proposal to be a demonstration trial to the FDA through C3TI, what you'll get is access to additional CDER subject matter experts. So of course, you'll be working with the review team. They are the experts on trials in that particular disease with those types of drugs. But we'll probably also give Mary Thanh Hai a call, and she might be a subject matter expert. She might even show up at your meeting when you come in to meet with us so that you have the best and brightest who understand the guidance and the policy and its original intent and helps that review team who may have not seen this particular approach. Again, if SSDC has not been used in a therapeutic area before, that review division just wouldn't have had that hands-on experience. They certainly will understand the guidance and have read that, but they may not, again, have that hands-on experience. Dr. Thanh Hai has had lots of experience, so we'll pull her in or others across the center, and we're working to identify those who have built that experience. So it's not always going to be Dr. Thanh Hai, if I can help her calm down. Secondly, what else we'll do is, as these trials go through maturity and they're completed and the data is locked and cleaned up and it's sent in and we're starting to review it, guess what? Inspectors come. And now a great thing about REdI was they used to do this, and they will go back to that. They would go out to field offices and you would sort of be there and you'd have compliance people in the room, or you'd have the ORA, Office of Regulatory Affairs inspectors in the room. And it was nice. You could really get to know who's going to show up at your site or at your sponsor and start to audit your trial master file and things. So what we're going to also be trying to do is think about prospectively when it's time for inspections to take place. We're going to be working with our folks in the field and in compliance to have sort of a proactive plan and also make sure that everybody's trained on what these innovative approaches are, because inspectors also may not have had hands-on experience. They may not understand some of the very good questions that we heard from the audience earlier that oh, well, the patients were saying this, it's in the source, but I don't see it in what was reported to the FDA. Why is that? That was because that trial maybe used a selective safety data collection approach. In addition, trials are global, so we are also going to be working on some of the global harmonization aspects. Can't guarantee that we'll always be aligned with our global regulators because they have different sort of regulatory frameworks or country type laws and regulations that they have to deal with, but we will at least work across the aisle to try and make those connections and help them understand what our perspective is at the same time as that they can understand ours. Ultimately, this will hopefully support implementation. Sometimes trials fail or drugs fail, that's okay, but we still want those trials to have a successful implementation of the innovative approach. And then we want to be able to share the information from that and what we learned. And this will ultimately, hopefully, enhance the body of knowledge across the board on clinical trial innovation. As I mentioned, we have 3 project areas. Initially, we'll hopefully be able to launch more because there's sort of economies of scale. This is hopefully a rinse and repeat model for supporting clinical trial innovation. So after these 3, we have a few demonstration trials lined up. We can move into other areas. So the 3 are Bayesian supplementary analyses, and I'm going to walk through each of these so you get a little bit more information. As mentioned this morning, selective safety data collection, and then streamlined trials embedded into clinical practice or STEP. All right, so Bayesian supplementary analyses. So I'm not going to give you guys a training on Bayesian statistics because I probably wouldn't do a very good job, but let's just say it's different from the traditional approach to statistics that's used in clinical trials, which is a much more frequentist-based approach. And what we're trying to do here is increase experience with clinical trialists, sponsors, their development or product development teams, and FDA review staff on using Bayesian statistical methods in their clinical trial settings that are otherwise what we would consider simple. And they're by far anything but simple, but the difference between simple and complex is sort of a terminology that we use to refer to trials that maybe have adaptive elements, multiple arms and agents like in a platform trial or basket trial, et cetera. But the idea is we'll work with the sponsor, C3TI and our demonstration team will work with the sponsor and the review team and the reviewers who are going to be reviewing that trial's data on implementing some additional supplementary or maybe what you might consider sensitivity analyses prospective in the clinical trial using the Bayesian approaches. And what this does is it doesn't change your primary analysis, so you don't have to worry, will FDA be able to accept my decision because it's a different approach that we've never used before. You've kind of de-risked the use of Bayesian by making it a supplementary analysis. And the benefit is you get experience. You get to use sort of the different programming methods. You might build up some libraries of different models on your computer. Apparently, I'm not a statistician, but apparently they build up all kinds of different programs and they like to rebuild those and put them back together in different ways. But if you've never done Bayesian methods before, you won't have any of those libraries. You don't have anything to start with. So this is a great way, again, on both sides, sponsor side and internally, for us to build some experience and put those libraries together. Most optimally, the trials that we're going to be looking for are phase 3 efficacy and safety trials or non-inferiority trials. Again, not borrowing any data. That's a concept in Bayesian from any previous trials. So this is going to be a very much sort of frequentist approach for the primary analysis. However, I will say, if you are interested in doing a primary Bayesian analysis trial, you can definitely get in touch with us at C3TI, and we can potentially discuss how we could collaborate with you and with the Office of Biostatistics within CDER to help support that trial, because we would not be against that at all. Next is the selective safety data collection. I won't have to go through this since you had an excellent training on it this morning. But again, the idea with being a partner in C3TI is that you get access to those additional resources, both from the subject matter expert side on the policy front and those who maybe helped originate the guidance, but also some perspectives, planning and support when it comes time for inspections and potentially with any global regulator harmonization type conversations. I think Dr. Thanh Hai went over the eligibility criteria as well earlier this morning, but this would be a trial most likely for an approved drug that's seeking a new indication in a very similar population. So you're going to be able to kind of extrapolate that well-established safety profile into that new population, maybe approved, seeking an expanded label, or it's evaluating a very specific safety concern. So this might be something like a post-marketing required trial for a previously approved product. And lastly, it's going to be a trial designed to provide additional evidence of efficacy when the current data is to support a well-characterized safety, when the current data do support a well-characterized safety profile. I think I'll maybe use that point to illustrate with all three of these demonstrations and probably all future demonstration projects. We really want these trials in the demonstration to be a regulatory grade. So they are intended to be submitted to the FDA and intended to support some sort of regulatory decision. Because this is something we heard when we were discussing with external stakeholders, that when it's a regulatory trial, that carries a lot more weight precedentially than if it's a non-regulatory trial, because it means the FDA made a decision. They had to sort of weigh in on it. And that's something that we can all look at as helping us understand how are they going to maybe interpret the findings from a trial in a future scenario. Last but not least, and my most favorite, well, I don't have any favorites. They're all great. Especially with Dr. Thanh Hai here, but the Streamlined Trials Embedded into Clinical Practice, or STEP demonstration project. So this is a program that aims to promote the adoption of more pragmatic trial design functions. There is no one single pragmatic trial, although I think Lung Pragmatica, which is an oncology trial, is probably pretty far to the most pragmatic it could possibly be. But when you think about creating a trial and making it more pragmatic, there's all sorts of different elements that you could be exploring. You could be exploring the eligibility criteria. You could be exploring the endpoints, ways to make those easier to be implemented. Ultimately, you're looking to see how can you simplify the trial such that it could maybe even be conducted in a more point of care like setting, because this is where most of the patients are. Again, if we have to bring all the patients into Johns Hopkins, which is a phenomenal academic medical center, it's going to be really challenging to reach out and get patients from the panhandle of Maryland, right there. That's very far away. So thinking about how we can streamline these trials and help us bring it back into the point of care setting, which has a lot of other benefits. As far as other advantages, obviously it can make the trials more resource efficient. While FDA is not in the business of making trials, cheaper or easier to conduct, I think kind of we all should be, because as you make trials cheaper and easier to conduct, you're able to sort of launch and run them more efficiently and more quickly. And that will ultimately get products to patients faster if they're safe and effective, or it'll help us sort of find the products that aren't safe and effective more rapidly, which is important as well. It could also help us attract broader study populations, as I mentioned, because we don't have to have our patients traveling, 100+ miles to get into our studies. And it can also ensure that all of the study objectives can be completed as robustly as possible. As for the eligibility criteria, the trials that we would be looking for in this particular demonstration would be those looking to test out or explore and incorporate any sort of pragmatic design element. It doesn't have to be completely pragmatic across the board. There's sort of all these different features of your trial you could be considering to make more pragmatic. Maybe you want to add some decentralized trial features, use a digital health technology, maybe even use selective safety data collection to reduce the burden of safety data that needs to be collected, which might enable that trial to be sort of conducted in a more closer to point of care type setting. Secondly, it most likely should be a trial later in pre-market development when the safety profile is reasonably well established. This just allows us to sort of kind of more focus on certain things and not have to worry about all the novelty that might be associated with a new product that we don't have a whole lot of experience with. Could also be a post-approval trial. This could be a product being repurposed for other uses, expanded indication, new populations, et cetera. I'm going to kind of just round out here, and then we can move into the questions. I think we've got plenty of time for questions. With, this concept of how do you promote clinical trial innovation? It's kind of nebulous. And first of all, most people like, what does an innovation even mean, right? Because some of these things we've been doing for decades. I think the pragmatic clinical trial design as a concept someone told me it was published in like the 70s. So this is not new stuff. Yet we're trying to promote it. And C3TI thought about this for a long time before we ultimately launched, and we put together sort of what we call a logic model or a program theory. And this will help us evaluate it down the road, maybe a year or 2 years from now, to see, did we make a difference with any of these new activities that C3TI launched with? So you can see just on the screen, I'm going to just highlight a couple of them. Initially, what we're primarily going to be looking at are short-term outcomes, such as, are folks finding the compass useful? Do they actually go in and search it? Can they find what they were looking for? If they go to our website, if they send an email or ask a question to get connected to a new program or to a point of contact within CDER, are we able to respond to those? So we track things like how long do folks stay on the C3TI website, on the Compass. We are triaging and tracking all of the triaging on our inquiries to our mailbox. So this allows us to kind of evaluate over time if we're making progress, if we're doing the things we least said we would do. As you move a little bit further down the road, hopefully we'd like to see more adoption of these innovative approaches in clinical trials. So probably C3TI might redo that analysis that Dr. Thanh Hai mentioned this morning, where you went in and looked at the trials that were sort of published over a period of time and see, did they do more selective safety data collection? Hopefully we would like to see that they did. And maybe point that back to C3TI. I'll probably just shower all the praises to Mary Thanh Hai and all of her presentations for promoting that. But then, of course, in the long term, as clinical trials do use the most innovative approaches and improve over time, that should ultimately improve outcomes for patients. Like at the end of the day, we want to be able to have drug development that's as efficient, as effective as possible, because that helps us get safe and effective medicines to patients. So with that, I think we can go ahead and turn it over to questions. And of course, if you have any questions that come to mind afterwards or something maybe a little bit more private, you can connect with me personally, or you can reach out to C3TI via the information on the screen.
Thank you, Dr. Bugin. So again, we encourage you to come up to the mics for in-house. We like to see some participation in real life. And then we'll alternate as, you know, as fairly as I could. We'll alternate and then we'll do it on online. So let's start with the first question here in-house.
Thank you for an easy way to remember the acronym, C3PO and C3TI. So the question is, you said that you're going to be a facilitator between the sponsor and the review division and help things faster, and then we can help innovation by making things be publicly disclosed. Operationally, right, meetings with our division, it's still going to be the same, or will we get separate meetings with C3TI? And what's the timeline for reviewing things that we want information? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So I wouldn't have a lot of friends if I said we'd have to do more meetings or do the meetings faster internally. I'd probably have a lot of friends externally. But we also just didn't want to short circuit the regulatory review process. That's a lot of R's. What C3TI hopefully will be able to do, because we've identified a trial in advance of any of those meetings to discuss the trial as a demonstration, we'll know it's coming. We'll kind of have some advanced warning, and the review division will know it's coming too, because the proposal is going to go directly into their IND, and they'll actually be the first persons to tell C3TI, yes, that does look like it would be a good fit for the demonstration program. And then C3TI sort of affirms and acknowledges that. And then from that point going forward, when you request a meeting to discuss that trial, and FDA does meetings all the time with sponsors to discuss the protocol. So if you want to come in early, even if you've got like a 2-page synopsis of your trial, you know, most likely FDA will grant that meeting and try to give you feedback if there's enough in there to give you feedback on, to help you ensure you have the most effective and efficient design possible. So what C3TI again will do is sort of work in the space of that timeline to make sure all the relevant subject matter experts can be pulled in. So you get like a little bit of an extra support from C3TI in the coordinating function. It won't necessarily, again, short circuit the review team. They're going to still be there. It just hopefully brings in those extra experts. The other benefit is we'll be tracking that entire interaction. So, you know, it takes, you know, many years for a trial to be sort of designed and then launched, and then the data to come in, and then, you know, finally be submitted and so on. So C3TI will hopefully have sort of a record alongside of the regular records that are already going to be in place to help ensure that all the subject matter experts are aware and are facilitating throughout the way. Secondly, I think there should be a higher level expectation when we say, you know, trial X with sponsor Y is part of the demonstration. Like that kind of should give you a little bit of a sense that FDA is watching this very closely and really does want at least the implementation of the innovative approach to be successful, because we know this is going to be looked at as a possible case study, as an example of how well to do this. Again, can't guarantee a drug's going to work or that a trial will be successful. There's just so many different factors at play, but at least the way we're implementing the innovative approach will be.
I just love the passion of our speakers. You can tell they are fully immersed in what they're doing, and their sole objective is to help you guys. Thank you. Next question in-house, please.
Hi, so understandably, a lot of these examples focus on later stage trials. I'm wondering if you're envisioning an expansion of focus areas that could be applied in like proof of concept or some earlier stage trials.
Yeah, it's a great question. So since we launched, and even maybe before we launched, there have been other proposals internally for possible demonstration project areas, coming out of some of the other existing programs. I'll use the Model-Informed Drug Development or the Quantitative Medicine Center of Excellence that was mentioned earlier this morning. So in that space, there may be opportunities for something a little bit earlier or more upstream in drug development where C3TI could partner to help demonstrate. I wasn't aware of this, but our commissioner said it this morning, and he's the boss. So I guess maybe AI could also be a place where C3TI could potentially partner. I know there's going to be a speaker later today talking about some of our efforts to help put out some guidance around artificial intelligence and machine learning and drug development. And so as we get that guidance out, there might be opportunities to potentially partner with trial sponsors for demonstrations there. I think a lot more needs to be sorted out, but yes, I think that has been explored.
Thank you.
See, we learn as well. So let's go online for a question, please.
To what extent can C3TI assist with Pediatric Research Equity Act or PREA required pediatric studies? Will C3TI consult with the Pediatric Review Committee and vice versa?
Great question. So I don't think C3TI would necessarily get involved in working through a pediatric study plan or a trial intended to fulfill a pediatric study plan requirement under PREA, unless they were looking to explore one of these innovative approaches in the demonstration. Or maybe another innovative approach. And let's say, again, there was maybe a digital health technology or a wearable that might enable the trial to be more effectively conducted in pediatric patients. We might be able to help facilitate getting connections with the relevant subject matter experts within the center to help them with that process. But again, we're probably not going to play any sort of a direct facilitator role with the regular processes there.
Thank you. If you have questions in-house, come please take advantage. This is your time. Question, please.
Hi, thank you, Kevin. My name is Jess Ross. I'm from Unlearn AI. And speaking about AI and speaking about, these technologies that are coming into development, I think that you have a real opportunity at C3TI to incorporate these into clinical trials at a larger scale. I know particularly in diseases like Alzheimer's disease, there are many, many trials that are coming out, and then the patient pool is going to get smaller and smaller. So I think I'm wondering about, it seems like many of the programs are geared towards sponsors, and there are other opportunities and companies that are developing technologies that could be broadly applied across trials. And especially knowing that trials take so long to happen, and if people want to see an example of a successful trial or FDA acceptance of a certain technology, it could be a decade away. So I wanted to see if what your thoughts are on the opportunity here with C3TI and being able to incorporate some of these technologies that could be broadly advantageous to society.
It's a great question. I don't think it's initially anything C3TI will be able to cover, but certainly there is a lot of innovation occurring in the clinical research, CRO space or other service provider space that's helping to enable clinical trials. For example, the use of AI to maybe enrich enrollment. I mean, certain pieces of that we'll probably see in the context of the drug development program, but many pieces, like if let's say a CRO or site is using Gen AI to help with informed consent, we might not see all of the detail. We would see the source of the actual informed consent document, the probably very 35-page plus long one that's for the lawyers most likely, but we wouldn't necessarily see the versions that were created with the additional Gen AI, maybe for translations, or if they were to say create a chat bot or something to help patients understand the informed consent document, just because that's not typically something that we're reviewing on the upfront side when the protocols are being designed. But I think it's a really important question, and it is something that we, FDA probably needs to think about how we can help disseminate some of those learnings more broadly. Because otherwise, I think potentially those become like competitive advantages for some of that industry that is helping to promote clinical research, and not something that could be shared more broadly.
Thank you. Next question in-house, please.
So thank you, Kevin. I have a question about you talk about the Bayesian software. So is so do we upload the data and run the data analysis there, or can we download the algorithm and run on in Python or in our software, or how did it work? Can you elaborate about this?
If I understand the question, or maybe also, let me just also demystify. So FDA is pretty unique in that we will reconduct the analyses pretty much ourselves. Even though we do have the summary data, we'll go and we want the source data and we want the analysis programs and we want to reconduct those internally. So when you submit to the FDA, you'll have to submit that data. And I think we also require the programs as well.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Question online, please.
What advances do you or do you not see occurring with informed consent to ensure that decentralized trials are diverse and inclusive of participants with different levels of access to real-time electronic document receipt and transmission?
Wow, great question. This is the one downside of being the clinical trial innovation guy. You get like all the questions. But, I guess I'll just share my personal perspective on this. And I think maybe you can raise this later with the speaker on AI from CDER, Tala Fakuri, because I think AI could potentially be very useful in the space of informed consent. I mentioned earlier that we have to have the informed consent document. There are a lot of required aspects to it that we simply can't change. But once you have that required set of data elements and information within the informed consent, you can then take it further. You can figure out what are the best ways to say translate it, maybe put it in different education level ranges. And AI is very good about doing this. It still requires a lot of verification, and you have to trust, go through and make sure you can trust what's been created, but it can help accelerate that process. And then I think something else that's been published in literature has been the use of maybe a chat bot. So you can almost have the patients have a follow-up conversation with a bot that's pretty much all based in the informed consent document. So I think those types of tools will potentially help to improve the comprehension and understanding of the informed consent process. But I think at the end of the day, the basic requirements are still always going to be there.
Thank you. Nobody's up at the mics. Next question online, please.
Regarding Compass, do sponsors have a say on what becomes open to the public link before data, which used to be confidential, is released?
This is a great question. If I could have
All
asked,
your questions
yeah.
are great.
Yeah, no, and I almost should have asked this one myself because it gives me an opportunity to say, yes, so sponsors, particularly if there's going to be any information added to the Compass that's coming out of the demonstration programs, they will have the opportunity to say what is sort of off limits for disclosure during the proposal process. So if you look on our website where you have information around what needs to be sent into their IND to be considered for a demonstration, they have to outline, in addition to some of the other important eligibility criteria that are listed, they'll have to outline sort of what, again, is off limit for disclosure. Otherwise, we'll consider sort of the other top line information to be possibly available for disclosure. Beyond the demonstration program, the FDA is, as always, going to protect commercial confidential information. There won't be anything shared that's not already in the public domain. The good news is there's quite a bit nowadays in the public domain. Most studies that are being conducted under IND, they have to report to clinicaltrials.gov. So a lot of the high-level study data elements are there, such as the primary objectives, the population, et cetera. So, I mean, there's a lot already. And if we know that a sponsor is implementing something innovative in one of these trials, assuming the sponsors agrees with that, that's something that we could simply just point to and say, hey, that's a trial. And then maybe the additional information could be gathered that way.
Are you good for two more?
Yeah, sure. I don't know when
Online?
lunch is.
Online, please.
Okay, another question from someone trying to access Compass. Do you need permission to access this?
No, so the external version of Compass is available. You don't need permission. It's on the FDA website right now.
That was a quick one. Last question then for Dr. Bugin, online, please.
How can innovative study designs such as adaptive trials or decentralized trials affect efficiency and effectiveness of drug development and regulatory decision making?
Great question. So I think as noted in maybe some of the demonstration programs. So I'll use sort of the streamlined trials embedded into practice example. These different approaches can make the trial, I would say, more optimized, so we don't have unnecessary burden on either the sites or on the patients to participate in these clinical trials. And when you sort of decrease that burden on what the patients have to do, maybe how far they have to travel, how many visits they have to come in person for, suddenly you make the trials more accessible. And as we make trials more accessible, the number one reason trials take so long is like the enrollment. It takes a long time. You probably screen fail way more patients on an order of magnitude than the ones you accept into the trial. And so as you increase the capture and you have more patients potentially participating, you're hopefully going to have more enrolling, and you're going to hit those enrollment targets a lot more quickly. And secondly, I think it also helps sites and the ability of sites to get activated more rapidly, because there may not be as many stringent requirements. Now, I say that with a grain of salt because new things, innovative things can sometimes actually add more burden initially as we get more experience with them. So sometimes you might be doing the traditional way plus the innovative way the first time you do something at a particular site. But over time, it will build that sort of muscle memory and experience, and it hopefully will lead to more efficient clinical trials on the operational piece too.
Thank you. I see some people taking notes. That means we're probably going to have a quiz later on. Thank you very much,
you.
Dr. Bugin.